Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar of Forest Birds and a Changing Climate. My name is Olivia Foster, and I lead the communications with the Ontario Woodlot Association, the organization that organizes Woodlands Appreciation Week. So today our speakers are from Birds Canada, Samreen Munham and Brendan Boyd. Before we dive in, I'm just going to share a few words about the Ontario Woodlot Association and Woodlands Appreciation Week. So for those that aren't familiar, the Ontario Woodlot Association is a member-based nonprofit organization with a network of regional chapters across Ontario. And our mission is to ensure the sustainability of Ontario's privately owned forests, both now and in the future. This year is the 6th annual Woodlands Appreciation Week, and our theme this year is Adapting Our Woodlots, Managing Forest Types in a Changing Climate, which is fitting for this webinar today, which is about forest birds and a changing climate. The Woodlands Appreciation Week this year is during March break, March 9th to 15th, and our goal is to encourage families to share the woods with their youngest family members to get out there and explore and learn and build memories together. So today's talk, Samreen and Brendan will be talking about how climate change is affecting bird species across the world, and including right here in Ontario. And before I pass it over to them, I'll just share a few housekeeping items. First off, everyone's microphones and videos are muted and turned off, except for today's speakers. This session is being recorded and it'll be shared on the OWA's YouTube account, and it'll also be shared with everyone who has registered for the webinar. I'll also just remind people that there is a Q&A box. It should be along the bottom of your screen, and we invite you at any point during the presentation to put in any questions that you might have for Samreen and Brendan, and we'll get to them at the end as we have time. And so with that, I will pass it over to you, Samreen and Brendan.
Perfect, thank you. I will share screen. Everything looks good?
Yep, looks perfect.
And go ahead, Brendan.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thanks so much, Olivia and the OWA for having us. I think I speak for both of us when I say that Samreen and I love to talk about birds. So any opportunity we have is excellent. Next slide. So who am I? And that's something I sometimes ask myself every day. My name is Brendan Boyd, and I am currently the Ontario Forest Birds Program Coordinator with Birds Canada, and I run the program alongside Samreen. I completed a doctorate degree at York University where I studied birds, and I was actually lucky enough to do a lot of my research in the Long Point area in Norfolk County, Ontario, in the Carolinian forests. And I've kind of always had a lifelong interest in birds and the natural world. In fact, I've been working with birds so long, I actually got started young enough that it was before they'd invented color film. This is a couple pictures of my work over the years, including when I did some raptor banding. We went out and caught raptors to take measurements and put bands on their legs. This is a red-tailed hawk. There's a few pictures from my research with wood thrushes. And I actually spent some time working with alligators and crocodiles, which you might think is kind of strange with birds, but they're actually the closest living relatives. So it's not quite that out there. And next slide.
Yeah, and so my name is Samreen, and Brendan, as Brendan said, I work with him as part of the Forest Birds at Risk program at Birds Canada. I completed my master's at Queen's University, looking at how species interactions between closely related bird species can influence their song. And unlike Brendan, I did not have a lifelong interest in birds and the natural world, but I stumbled into it after taking a course in undergrad and got really interested in research and have worked with a few different insect species, plant species, and of course, lots of different birds. So it's great to be here. Thank you for having us, and I'll turn it over to Brendan to begin.
All right, so today we're going to go over a few different topics. This is a graph from the Canadian government, and they track temperatures across the country. And you can see pretty clearly that over time, the average temperature has increased. Now you can also see that it's pretty variable. Some years it's a bit colder, some years it's a bit warmer. Overall, the trend is going up. So my portion of the talk is going to be going over some examples of how climate change is affecting birds. And then Samreen is going to explain how we monitor those changes by keeping track of bird populations. And then a big part of that is how we identify birds, because part of monitoring bird populations is knowing what species of birds you're actually looking at. Next slide. So one of the really big issues with climate change is something that we call phenological mismatch. And a simpler way to think of this is just food mismatch. And here in Canada, and I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with this, you get this huge emergence of insects in the spring. And if you've ever walked into a woodlot in like late May or early June, the mosquitoes certainly let you know that this is happening. And it's basically the same in all temperate regions around the world, is when you get this winter, the insects are dormant, and then as soon as it warms up in the spring, they all emerge and you have this rich abundance. And that's what the birds really need to breed effectively. A lot of people think the birds that we have here, they go south in the winter to get away from the cold, but there are like our birds that are coming back the next year when it warms up. And although this is correct, it's actually kind of the opposite pattern. We figure that those are actually tropical birds, and they're making the trip up to Canada to breed for the summer, and then they're heading back to their home in the tropics for the winter time. And it's because of this big abundance of food that it's worthwhile for them to make that huge journey all the way up here to breed and produce young and then head back again. And we're finding that temperature predicts when these insects are going to come out in the spring. And as this temperature increases, the insect emergence is occurring earlier and earlier each year. And this is affecting birds with different life history strategies in different ways. Next slide. So the first example we're going to look at is a European bird, and they have some species of European birds that they've spent like a very long time monitoring populations of them. So they're great examples for this type of study. This is a bird called a great tit, and Europeans, they call chickadees tits. So you can think of this as basically a chickadee. It's a resident bird, just like the chickadees in your yard. You see it around all year, coming to bird feeders. And what they found in this long time that they've been monitoring these populations is that the date that they lay their first egg in a given year is getting earlier. And when they compare this over on the right side here, when they compare this, the spring temperatures in the area of their study, they found that it matches very well with the way temperature is increasing. So the spring is getting warmer, the egg laying is getting earlier. So why would they be doing this? Next slide. And what they found is that this main a type of insect that these birds rely on, it's a winter moth caterpillar. Again, like other insects, it comes out in the spring in response to a certain amount of warmth. And they've tracked these caterpillars, and they found that these caterpillars are actually coming out 2 weeks earlier now. And when they make a graph and they plot this against when the birds are laying eggs, they find it matches up very well. So as these caterpillars are emerging earlier and earlier, the birds are laying their eggs earlier. And this works really well for them because they are resident, they are around in the spring, and they're able to track these temperatures. So they can kind of keep track of the way the spring's going and they can make adjustments. Next slide. And another interesting aspect of this research is that over time, they found that some female birds, and again, this is a study population, it's really convenient for the researchers because these birds use nest boxes, so they can keep track of the same ones year after year. They'll go in and they'll put bands on their legs so they can tell individuals apart from each other. So not only can they keep track of their survival when they lay their first egg every year, but they can also go in and band the young in the nest box to keep track of those so they know who's parents of whose, who produced which young, how they do in the future. It's a really complex study. And they found that some female birds are better able to adjust when you have a really warm spring or a really cold spring, where some birds can, say, lay their eggs 10 days earlier or 10 days later, whereas other birds can only lay their eggs, say, 5 days earlier or 5 days later. And they found that this trait is actually passed on to their young. And when they looked at this in the early years of the study in the 70s, they found that it didn't matter if you could lay your eggs really early or really late, you were going to produce about the same number of young. And that's what we refer to as fitness here. But in more recent years, what's really interesting is that they found the more flexibility you had, the more young you could produce. Birds who could only lay their eggs a couple days early or a couple days late are only producing about one per nest, whereas birds that can go that full 10-day range or more early or late are producing many more. And what this means is that because these birds are producing more, eventually the majority of this population is going to have this higher level of flexibility in when they lay their eggs. And this is really neat because it shows that these birds are actually evolving in response to climate change. And this gives us a lot of hope for the future because it shows even though the temperatures are increasing, at least some birds, especially residents and short distance migrants, will probably be able to adjust fast enough to keep up with it. Next slide. So conversely, there's another group of birds called long distance migrants, and this is where we start running into trouble. So many of the warblers that we have here in Canada, they winter down in the tropics, South America. They don't know if it's a warm spring or a cold spring because you just can't tell from down there. So how do they assess it? Well, ultimately they can't. The example we use here is a bird called a pied flycatcher, and this breeds in Europe, but you can think of it as kind of an equivalent to the flycatchers that we have here and warblers and other long distance migrants. And it is really hard for them to time this big emergence of insects because they don't know what's going on. So if they fly up to Europe too early, they could end up hitting one of those weird late spring snowstorms that we get where they get 4 or 5 days of freezing weather and they might not survive that. So there's a huge cost with arriving too early and then arriving too late. There's also a big cost because they might have done that whole trip for nothing. If they arrive after all the other mates are taken, maybe all the territories are taken, or maybe they've missed that big emergence of insects, so there's not enough food to successfully raise their brood. Migration is the most dangerous time of year for these birds, so it's really important that they make the best of having to do that huge thousands of kilometers trip north and back. All right, next slide. So what dictates how or when these birds migrate? Ultimately, it comes down to genetics. So these birds have sort of programmed into them when they should be migrating from the south to the north. And this is also influenced by the day length, because as we know, the day length changes a bit throughout the year. So they use these as cues for when they should go. But this doesn't change a lot over time. There is some variation, again, with genetics. Some birds are going to be predisposed to traveling a little bit early or a little bit later. But where they've studied this in Europe, they found that their population of pied flycatchers is not arriving any earlier. So they're remaining pretty consistent for the 20 years that they tracked it during the study. What's interesting, and it's in the lower right here, is what they did find that their first egg dates are getting earlier. So they're arriving at the same time, but they're laying their egg up to 10 days earlier. So what does this mean? This means that after this huge journey migrating from the tropics, instead of having almost 2 weeks to recover, regain some fat stores, and rest up and prepare for this next huge thing they have to do, which is nest building and laying eggs and raising those young, they now don't really have any time to do this. They have very little time to recover. And there's going to be a point where they can't lay their eggs any earlier to try to match this emergence of insects if they continue arriving at the same time. So, as I mentioned before, There is some flexibility, and if spring is getting earlier, those birds that arrive a little bit earlier probably are going to produce more young. But the question is, how fast will this pattern take place, and will it be fast enough to keep up with this spring emergence of insects that's becoming earlier? Next slide. And now another study that also looked at pied flycatchers. Samreen's going to talk a bit more about monitoring techniques, and she'll cover something similar to this. But they've kept track of different populations across Europe. So these guys are found in a bunch of different areas in Europe. And each one of those populations is sort of tracked individually, where somebody will go out and count those birds and see if the same number is coming back year after year, or if there's fewer birds coming back year after year. And they found that this is different. Different populations of pied flycatchers have different what we call population trends. So whether their numbers are going down or up. And what these researchers did is they went to these areas where they're keeping track of population, and they looked at when the caterpillars were coming out that they rely on for food. And what they found in this graph is that on the left side, this is where the caterpillars are coming out the earliest, and it corresponds to the population of pied flycatchers that are actually declining the most. So we're losing the most pied flycatchers. Whereas on the right side of the graph, this is where the caterpillars are coming out at about historical times that they normally would. And those populations are not declining nearly as severely, or they're remaining relatively stable. So this study was groundbreaking at the time because it was the first study to really tie climate change to actual verified bird declines. And it showed us a pattern in pied flycatchers that could be occurring elsewhere. Next slide. I know I've talked about Europe, but what about North America? Here in Canada, we have this huge boreal forest, and it just this huge swath of trees that goes across the north. It's really incredible. And it's been estimated that we have somewhere between 3 and 5 billion birds that travel between the tropics and the boreal forest to breed each year. And because it's so inaccessible and so big, we don't know for sure that this same timing mismatch is occurring. But we can extrapolate and say that it very likely is, which is a little bit worrying. All right, next slide. So the last effect of climate change that I'm going to cover today is the changes in breeding and wintering ranges. So this is looking at birds that are mostly year-round residents, and a lot of the reason why they don't exist further north than they already do is because of temperatures and winter conditions that keep them from doing that. And this example here is called a northern mockingbird. And it's a bird, if you've ever been down to Florida or the southeastern states, they can be quite common. They're very vocal and they're kind of everywhere. They'll even sing at night sometimes. Really hard to miss. And they're a bird that in the 1980s was pretty uncommon in Ontario. And it was pretty exciting to see one. And the information that we're using here is from something called the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas. And Samreen is going to tell you a bit more about that so you can understand how that works. But essentially what it shows is where these birds were in 1980 versus 2001. And you can see in the 2001 map, their numbers have expanded greatly. And there's a few other species that have done this. A lot of you may have seen red-bellied woodpeckers coming to your feeders. They're one that, again, would have been fairly uncommon in the 1980s, but numbers much higher in 2001, spreading across the province. And we have a breeding bird atlas going on now, so it'll be really interesting to see where they're at today. Next slide. And while some birds are expanding northwards as a result of climate change, there are some that may be in trouble as a result as well. And the one we're looking at here is Canada's national bird, the Canada jay. And this is a non-migratory bird that lives in the boreal forest. And it's kind of the epitome of Canada because it survives in these sometimes really harsh conditions year round. They're really amazing. They're really charismatic. In the north, they've often learned that people are a sign of food, so they'll get quite close. They have a lot of personality. They love to hang around campsites. I know they used to follow indigenous hunting parties, and they would try to pick up scraps from any kills they got. And this is because during the winters, to get by, one of the strategies they use, you can imagine things are barren in the boreal forest in the dead of winter, is they'll find food and cache it all through the year. And these birds have been recorded caching up to like 100,000 food items in a winter, up to 1,000 a day. So you can imagine the memories they must have to keep track of everything. Now, to cache this food, they'll find stuff, and this could be like dead spiders, bugs, little bits of fat from wolf kills, bits of food if they're around areas where there's people, and they'll kind of put it in a layer of saliva and tuck it behind bits of bark on trees. And they need to do that above the snowpack because the snow can sometimes be meters deep. And they rely on that food not only in the winter to feed themselves, but these birds nest super early. In fact, they're probably starting to nest right now in the north. They'll be nesting in March, which is incredible. And they rely on this cached food to get through that. But now that we're getting more and more of these warm periods in the winter, where it goes up, I think everybody's probably used to those strange periods where it gets all foggy and it's above freezing. Um, and that's causing some of their food caches to spoil during the winter. So normally stuff that would be frozen solid is now going bad and they can't use it for food anymore. So they're losing out on this hoarded food that they've placed to survive the winter cold. And as a result, their numbers seem to be kind of shifting northwards. We're losing them in the south. You used to be able to go to Algonquin Provincial Park and pretty reliably find Canada jays. And it seems to be becoming harder with every year. This is an animation of the different breeding bird atlases that placed 20 years apart. And you can see in Atlas 1, they were pretty common in the southern portion of the range. In Atlas 2, the coloring is a little bit more diffuse. And by Atlas 3, they've almost completely disappeared from the south. And with that, I will pass it over to Samreen for how we monitor our birds.
Okay, perfect. So Brendan's talked a little bit about ways that climate change is impacting birds, but how do we actually monitor these effects? How do we know that how these birds' ranges are changing? So I'll talk a little bit about the main ways we do that here in Ontario, starting with something called the Breeding Bird Survey. And this is something that was started way back in the 1960s and was one of the first really standardized scientific and continent-wide monitoring protocols that was established to get a sense of how breeding bird abundances are changing over time. And it involves, it's all volunteers, and they go out and they have a route assigned to them with about 50 stops along a road. And at each of those stops, they're doing a 3-minute count during the breeding season to note down all the birds that they're hearing and seeing at each stop. And so when you've got, almost 3,000 of these routes across the continent being done year after year for decades, you establish a really powerful long-term data set that you can get really informative trends from. So here we have just a couple examples. On the left-hand side, we have the hairy woodpecker, which I think is probably present in most people's woodlots in the audience. And you can see that over time, their population, or the average number of hairy woodpeckers detected per route, has increased. And I think that that's not too surprising considering how much, we've had lost our ash and lots of other trees. And then on the flip side, we have an example of a declining trend. The wood thrush is another very common forest bird here in southern Ontario, but we've been seeing significant declines in their trends. But it's also interesting to see that in the past few years, it seems like that trend might be reversing or at least plateauing. And another really great thing too is that these trends, although the trends that I showed you are kind of the average across the range, we're able to also get finer scale information because we know in certain areas birds are going to be doing better than others. And especially in the face of climate change, I think this is really important because we know climate change is going to have different effects in different areas. So this kind of information is incredibly valuable to understand how different populations of the same species might react differently. One big drawback of the breeding bird survey is that, again, they're only doing 3-minute counts. It makes for a very quick and easy practical thing that volunteers are able to do. But you might be missing stuff, and it's a roadside survey, so it might not be necessarily representative of all birds. And that's where we have something that's a lot more intensive come into play, which Brendan mentioned earlier, which is called the Breeding Bird Atlas. And this happens often at like the province or state level. And in Ontario, we're on our third one, as Brendan mentioned. It happens every 20 years, and it's basically an all hands on deck kind of effort to document all of Ontario's breeding birds over a span of 5 years. So the first one was in the early 1980s. The second one was from 2001 to 2005. And now we're currently in the third one, which started in 2021, and we're in the final year of that. So if you want to participate, it's your last chance, or you're going to have to wait 20 years. But it's really great. Everyone just goes out. We divide the province into squares and try to systematically and intensively survey each square for all the birds we can possibly find and confirm breeding evidence. And we get really great information, for example, like this. I know a lot of you have told me about the red-headed woodpeckers you have around your woodlots. And in the 1980s, during the first atlas, all the red and orange squares indicate where they were confirmed breeding or were present during the breeding season. And then we can compare that to the early 2000s when we did the second atlas. And all of these squares that have just a black dot indicate where they were present during the first atlas, but then were absent during the second atlas. And that's quite a remarkable, decrease in range compared in just these 20 years. And we can actually see that reflected in the breeding bird survey data during those years. And what's interesting is that, again, we're seeing kind of this plateau in the past few years. And when you look at the kind of preliminary data from the atlas that's currently going on, we are kind of seeing the same kind of trend. And it's great when you've got these multiple survey protocols that are showing us the same trend, because then we can be more sure that the trend we're seeing is something real and not just an artifact of the methods that we're using. So the breeding bird atlas, super, super great. But one thing that's a little bit of a drawback, same with the breeding bird survey, is that Northern Ontario has not as many volunteers as Southern Ontario. And so that's kind of a big gap, especially like Brendan said, the boreal forest, it's incredible. There's so many birds that are breeding there, and we really want to get a sense of how their populations are doing. So how do we do that when much of it is inaccessible and there's so few volunteers? And that's where we enter what I think is quite a creative monitoring scheme, the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network. And this is a network of bird observatories across Canada that are strategically situated in spots where migratory birds tend to funnel and concentrate on migration. So we can't go to the birds during their breeding season, but we know where they tend to concentrate. And so every spring and fall, when they're coming up and when they're going down from their breeding grounds and wintering grounds, we count and catch the birds to get a sense of, from year to year, we're doing this in the same standardized way. We can start to get a sense of, are we catching and counting more birds now than we were 20 years ago? And for a lot of species that breed up there, this is really one of the only ways that we can get kind of robust trends for their populations. And one example here is the Canada warbler. That's Birds Canada's mascot. And it's also a species at risk in the province. And at Long Point Bird Observatory down here in Norfolk County, they were catching and counting a lot less Canada warblers now than they were, just a few decades ago. And interestingly, for this one, we do see a similar trend with the breeding bird survey. But again, it's nice that you have these multiple streams of evidence that can give you more confidence that the trends that you're seeing are in fact real and not an artifact of, a certain method. And then we also have some specialized programs in the province. For example, the Ontario Forest Bird Monitoring Program. The Breeding Bird Survey, as I mentioned, is a roadside survey, and a lot of atlasing effort is often done from the roadside as well. And so you risk missing out on the birds hanging out in the middle of forest because they prefer that interior forest habitat. And so the Canadian Wildlife Service developed this program back in 1987, and it was transferred to Birds Canada in 2020. And again, it's another volunteer-based program where volunteers go into their favorite local large forests and they survey for birds twice each summer. And because we're doing this year after year in a very standardized way at the same locations, the changes that we're seeing, reflect actual changes in the birds' populations. And then another thing that perhaps members are already aware of, there's Project Woodland Watch run by the OWA. If you want to track the birds that are in your woodlot, which is really important, especially here in Southern Ontario, where so much of the land is privately owned. It's a really quick and easy way. It's hosted on Nature Counts, which is Birds Canada's repository for all bird information, and anyone can go in and access that information for conservation or research or monitoring. And then you can also keep track of the birds for, if you've got an MF tip plan or something like that. So that's something you can sign up for if you're interested in. And then Brendan and I, as we mentioned, we run the Forest Birds at Risk program here at Birds Canada. We're boots on the ground every summer, along with some field staff that we hire every summer. And we survey public and private woodlots across southwestern Ontario and southeastern Ontario. We have 5 species at risk that we tend to focus on, but every time we're in a forest, we're documenting all the forest birds. And this program's been running now for about 10 years. And so we've got a really great long-term data in, again, both southwestern and southeastern Ontario. But we're always looking for new woodlots to survey. I've done a lot of surveys in OWA members woodlots in the past few years, and I always love it. I love when you join me on the walks as well. So if you're interested, I'll have our contact information at the end of the presentation. Please do reach out. We'll give you a bird list of all the birds we come across, as well as forest health risks like tree diseases and invasive species with coordinates. And of course, we don't share the information with anyone without your permission. So if you want to go on a forest bird walk, I can teach you all the forest birds in person. Always down to do that. And maybe you're like, you know what, these programs sound great, but I don't have the time for that. And I completely understand. But the thing is, even your casual observations are super important. And I know a lot of you are already birders and you're already familiar with eBird, but for those that aren't, this is an incredibly I cannot say enough good things about this platform, but it's just an easy way for you to track all of the birds that you're seeing, whether it's in your woodlot or anywhere else in the world. And you can also see the things that other people are observing as well. And it makes it really easy for you to, see how many birds are in your woodlot, what you can expect at different times of the year. And even the most casual of observations, you might think, oh, there's nothing important in my woodlot, and you're very wrong. Even the robin on your lawn that you see year after year is important because it leads to things like this. We think of the robin as a really common bird. What could be going on with the robin? But by combining all of those millions of casual observations, we see that actually it looks like robins might be declining in a big part of their range. In some parts of the range, it looks like they're increasing, but on the eastern side, it definitely looks like there's something wrong. And because of this data, we're actually able to, do further research and see, well, what's causing these declines. It could be climate change, it could be something else, it could be a combination of things, which is often the case for a lot of species. But definitely don't undersell the value of those casual observations. And I want to highlight too, like eBird data has been used in over 1,000 publications, and that just keeps on, kind of skyrocketing year after year. There's lots of publications that have looked at how observations submitted to eBird, correlate with climate change or lots of other different types of studies too. So all of the information that you have and are able to share it and collect is useful in some way for someone. And then you might be saying, well, that sounds great, but I don't know my birds. And there's definitely a bit of a steep learning curve when it comes to birds. It took me a while to get to the point where I'm at, and there's still a lot I don't know. But I would say, start small. You don't need to learn all 500 birds that have ever been detected in Ontario. Just start with the birds that are in your woodlot, which is a much smaller amount. It's a much more manageable amount of species, and they're going to be there year after year. So it's a great place to start familiarizing yourself with birds around you. And there's a few tips I have here of just ways to make it easier for you to become familiar with the birds. And one of the easiest ways, again, to narrow down what to expect in your area is to look at the range and habitat. I am down here in Long Point right now, in the southern portion of Ontario, which is the deciduous forest region. And so there's a lot of species like red-eyed vireos. That's going to be one that's in every single one of your woodlots. I can tell you that right now. And then there's lots of other common birds like scarlet tanagers and ovenbirds. But we also get some species, because we're so far south, some of the species that you tend to find kind of on the other side of the lake creep up into Ontario. And so we have things like hooded warblers. And then unfortunately, because this region also has very little forest cover, we have quite a lot of species at risk. You know, the birds that were once much more common in this region, which now have very scattered populations. Stuff like the cerulean warbler, the Acadian flycatcher, Louisiana water thrush, and prothonotary warbler. And so, you know, those remnant forests, especially again, because a lot of it is privately owned, are really important for sustaining the populations of these species. And so there are things to watch out for if you are in this southern region. As we move up into the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, we still have a lot of deciduous forest and a lot of forest cover, but we start to get a lot more coniferous forest mixed in. And so you get a lot of the same species that you see in the deciduous forest, but you also start to see a lot more of the stuff that's a little bit more characteristic of the north. But this region, you know, has really significant populations of a lot of species that are unique or have kind of strongholds in this region for the province. The cerulean warbler, which is one of our target species. And actually, the cerulean warbler, the most cerulean warblers that you can find in Canada, most of the cerulean warblers in Canada are in this region just north of Kingston. So it's a super, super important area. And it's not just a transition zone, but has a lot of unique birds that call it home. And then we move up into the wonderful boreal forest, and you see, you know, a huge turnover. Of course, there's a lot more coniferous species here and a lot less deciduous species. So the bird community changes a lot. Like Brendan said, there are millions of birds that call this place home, and the importance of it cannot be understated for Ontario's bird populations. A lot of the birds that we find here in Southern Ontario only on migration, this is where they're going for the summer. So we get a lot of those, you know, colorful warblers that we're excited to see in spring in just a few weeks. The Cape May, the bay-breasted warbler, Tennessee warbler, the blackpoll warbler. And then there's also year-round residents like the boreal chickadee and Canada jay. There's lots of owls specific to this region, some woodpeckers, grouse. There's lots of really unique species that you know, are really specific to this region. And so if you're in this region compared to the deciduous, you're going to expect a completely different suite of birds. And then the final forest region in Ontario is the Hudson Bay lowlands. There's only about 20% forest cover in this area, and a lot of it you're expecting the same kind of boreal forest, just kind of creeping up into these forests, like again, those warblers, boreal chickadee, kinglets, and stuff like that. So knowing where you are makes a big difference in what birds to expect. I would caution against using habitat alone because birds do weird things and they show up in places that you least expect them. Sometimes we find birds from Europe or Asia in Ontario. And, you know, especially I think with a lot of changing patterns in climate, we're seeing more and more vagrancy. And so once you've narrowed down, it's always good to make sure you're paying attention to the details too. So I'll go through just a few of the details you want to pay attention to as you're trying to make your identifications. One of the ones that's commonly used, of course, is size and proportion. And this is a classic example. Again, I know this is probably something you think every day in your woodlot when you see a woodpecker. Is it a downy woodpecker or is it a hairy woodpecker? The hairy woodpeckers are larger, but that difference can be hard to assess when you don't have them conveniently right next to each other, like in the picture here. But one really good way for identifying them is their beak, because the downy woodpecker has a very small beak. It makes it look kind of cute, and the beak is only about half the length of its head, whereas the hairy woodpecker down here has its beak that's about the same length of its head. And so even if you don't have them right next to each other, you can identify the species. And this is a great thing in general, you know, whether it's beak proportion, the wings, the tail proportion and relative to other parts of the body, how big the head is in relation to the body. Those are all features that you want to be paying attention to. And then, I mean, you know, we love birds for their colors. Sometimes the color differences are really obvious. For example, here we have scarlet tanager, which is a common forest bird in Ontario. And we have here a summer tanager, which is a bird that just kind of shoots up into Ontario every now and then. And you can tell them apart, at least the males, because the scarlet tanager has these nice bold black wings and the summer tanager is all red. But then sometimes those color differences can be much more subtle. For example, here we have a wood thrush and a Swainson's thrush, and the wood thrush has much kind of oranger tones to its upper parts, whereas the Swainson's thrush is much grayer. and duller. And then the spotting, of course, on the underside is different too. So definitely something to keep an eye out for. And there's other plumage patterns that can be really useful as well. So for example, the underparts often are really useful. Some birds, whether they're unmarked underparts, whether they've got streaks like a lot of sparrows or spotting like a lot of thrushes, the color of the streaking or the spots, the location, maybe they're just on the flanks, maybe they're just on the breast. That's all useful to know. Other features that can be really important are the details of the wing. A lot of species have what we call wing bars, which are these kind of color patterns that cut across the wing. So again, the number of wing bars, the color of wing bars, the width of the wing bars, and the absence of wing bars are things that you want to know because those can be really definitive. And then a lot of the times there's, facial features that are really important. So it could be the crown. It could be, in this case, a lot of species have distinctive eye rings. So again, the color of the eye ring, the shape of the eye ring, the width of the eye ring, whether there is an eye ring, that's something that you want to pay attention to as well. Now, I hope I haven't led you a little bit astray because we're talking about forest birds here. And, I've done a lot of forest bird surveys, and 90% of what you're going to detect is actually by sound. So, um, but as I think that sound, I think there's something really valuable in being able to walk through your woodlot and understand all of the things that you're hearing in your soundscape. And it's, if you're lazy like me, you don't even have to lift your binoculars to know what's around. And it's definitely takes a while to build up that knowledge, but I think it's a really fun way of getting to know your woodlot. And there are some things you can look into that make it easier to learn. So for example, a lot of people like to use mnemonics. And this is just, a phrase that's reminiscent of whatever the bird is singing or calling. Chickadees, you're going to be hearing that one a lot these days. A lot of people say that it sounds like they're saying cheeseburger, or to me, it sounds like they're saying Phoebe. If my recording, I had some recordings, but they're not going to work. So you're just going to have to imagine what it sounds like, or go out in your woodlot and you'll hear it probably. And then another bird that you're going to be seeing in the next month in big, big numbers, and you've probably heard the song but didn't know what it was, is the white-throated sparrow. They will sing on migration even though they're going up to the boreal forest. And so their song sounds like they're saying, "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada." And again, if I knew how to whistle, I would whistle it for you, but you're just going to have to believe me or look up a recording after this webinar. Or better yet, again, listen for it when you're out in the forest in a month's time. They literally sing all the time, and it's really fun actually in the fall because you'll hear the new birds trying to sing, but they can't quite get it right. So mnemonics can be great, but they're kind of subjective, and one person hears "Oh Sweet Canada, Canada," and someone hears something else. Some birds just have songs that you can't really put words to, and so instead we just rely on sound descriptions. And that's what you're going to find in a lot of field guides. And so this is a northern parula, which is a type of warbler. Again, we're going to be seeing in a couple of months. And their song can be described as a trill that rises in pitch, has a buzzy quality, and ends with an abrupt note. Now, again, if my recording was working, I could show you exactly what I'm talking about, but you're just going to have to believe me for now. And I encourage you to look it up so that you can find a parula for yourself this spring. So sound descriptions are great, but I know some of us are more visual learners. And so we have something called spectrograms or sonograms, which are basically a picture of sound. And so you have time on the x-axis, on the y-axis, you have the pitch or the frequency, and then the color intensity is the volume. So this is an example of a prairie warbler song, and you can see it's as those notes are kind of increasing, that means it's getting higher and higher pitched. And this is a really fun one that I really recommend you look up. It's one of the best songs, I think, in Ontario. It kind of sounds like some people make it sound like it's an elevator rising. So that's a really fun one, especially if you're ever over at Pinery on the dunes, something to keep an eye out for. But there's a lot of great resources online for getting spectrograms and recordings for free, like the Macaulay Library through eBird. There's a program called Raven you can get for free, and the repository called Xenocanto as well. And then, of course, there's behavior and habits. If you see a bird on a tree bark, it's probably a woodpecker, a nuthatch, or a creeper. If you see a bird gleaning insects from foliage, it's probably a bird like a warbler or a kinglet or a flycatcher. And then if you see a bird, rustling around in the leaves on the forest floor, it's probably an ovenbird or a thrush or a sparrow. Again, birds do weird things, so that's not a hard and fast rule, but it can help you narrow things down. Some birds tend to have unique habits too, like the eastern phoebe, which is just starting to show up in Ontario. So if you're, any wooded area near water, they'll be there, and they like to perch somewhere and wag their tail kind of constantly as they're perched. And then they'll often sally out, catch an insect, and return to the same perch. So that's a great way of identifying them. And there's other species too that like to bob their tails. And then sometimes even flight patterns, can be distinctive. Woodpeckers have a very undulating flight, and then tree swallows are also, they've started to show up in Ontario. So keeping an eye out for their kind of, acrobatic flight. There's nothing that quite flies like a swallow. So when you put all of those things together, you can be quite confident that the bird you think you're looking at is the bird that you're looking at. And of course, I know a lot of you tell me about how much you love this app. You don't have to learn your birds on your own. The Merlin Bird ID app is free. It's basically a field guide in your pocket. It's got maps, it's got pictures, it's got recordings, and it has a really great feature where you can record audio and it'll tell you what it's hearing in person. You do have to take it with a grain of salt because sometimes it's wrong and it'll tell you something that is not actually there, but generally I think it's a really great resource for, as you're starting to learn how to ID birds by sound. It's fantastic. And again, don't discount the value of those casual observations, because that's how we tell how birds are responding to climate change, right? Is by everybody contributing to these shared databases of bird occurrence. And if you're not a bird person, kudos to you for sticking it out this long in the webinar. But just managing your woodlot in a way that you're maintaining habitat, managing it sustainably like OWA members do, and using all of the resources that you have at hand. Again, like I have been on so many walks with OWA members, and I always love to see how much they love their woodlot, and they're always so interested in, making the forest the best place to be for birds, people, all the things that call it home. And so, thank you for all that you're already doing without maybe even realizing it. And thank you for listening to our presentation. If you have any questions, we're happy to answer them in the time we have, and you're also welcome to email us anytime.